You've spent your entire life believing in lies, lies so profound, so intertwined with your perception of reality, that you don't even recognize them as lies. You call them truth, reality, the way things are. Eckhart Tolle calls these lies the illusions of the ego, and he explains that spiritual awakening is essentially the collapse of these illusions. One by one, they dissolve, and what remains is something that words can't adequately describe. Today, I'm going to show you 8 illusions that disappear when you awaken. 8 fundamental lies that have controlled your life without you even knowing. And when you really see through them, when they dissolve, you discover that you can never go back to believing them. This isn't theory, it's experience. It's what happens when consciousness breaks free from the structures that imprisoned it. Before we begin, an important observation. Seeing through these illusions doesn't mean that your external life changes immediately. You may still have the same challenges, the same relationships, the same circumstances. What changes is how you relate to it all. And that internal change is more radical than any external change could be. Tolle frequently says that the ultimate purpose of his practices is to awaken consciousness, to peel back the illusions created by our minds, and to live authentically in the stillness of the present moment. That's what we're going to explore now. The first illusion that disappears is the illusion that you are your thoughts. This is perhaps the most fundamental illusion. You've spent your entire life believing that the voice in your head is you, that your thoughts define who you are, that you are the thinker. This illusion is so deep that most people can't even conceive that it could be different. For them, thoughts and identity are the same thing. When they think, "I'm anxious" or "I'm insecure," they believe they're describing an immutable truth about who they are. Tolle defines awakening exactly as the disidentification from thought. When you realize that the voice in your head, that compulsive and incessant inner dialogue, is not you, then you've begun to awaken. Before awakening, you're completely fused with your thoughts. You can't separate the observer from the observed. Every thought seems like absolute truth because you are the thought. There's no distance. After awakening, you discover that there's someone observing the thoughts, a space of consciousness that exists before, during, and after each thought. You still think, but now you use thought instead of being used by it. And here's the most extraordinary thing. This perception isn't something you conquer or develop. It's something you discover was always there. The observer has always existed. You were just so absorbed in the content of the thoughts that you never noticed the space in which they appear. Tolle describes this as rising above thought, not falling below it. In the awakened state, you still use your thinking mind when necessary, but in a much more focused and effective way. You're free from involuntary inner dialogue. There's an inner quietude that doesn't depend on silencing thoughts, but on not identifying with them. The second illusion that disappears is the illusion of separation. The ego convinces you that you're a completely separate being, that there's you here and the world out there, that other people are fundamentally other, strangers, different. This is the illusion that causes the most suffering in the world. Wars, conflicts, exploitations, all are born from this basic belief that we're separate entities competing for limited resources. If you really are separate, then the other's gain is your loss. The other's security is your threat. Tolle explains that the ego exists only in the realm of division. It thrives on the feeling of me here and the world there. This separation is the basis of all conflict, all competition, all fear of the other. When this illusion disappears, you realize something extraordinary, sir. You're not in the universe. You are the universe. There's no real separation between you and anything else. The same consciousness that looks through your eyes looks through everyone's eyes. This doesn't mean you lose your individuality. It means you realize that your individuality is like a wave in the ocean. The wave has its unique shape, but it's never been separate from the water. It's never been separate from the ocean. Many spiritual teachers talk about this, but Tolle brings a particular clarity. He explains that the illusion of separation is what Buddhism calls Maya. The psychologist Charles Tart calls it consensual trance, a state much deeper and more artificial than ordinary hypnosis. We're all hypnotized into believing that we're isolated beings in a hostile universe. When you awaken from this collective hypnosis, the hostility disappears, the fear of the other dissolves. You realize that attacking anyone is attacking yourself, that helping anyone is helping yourself. The separation was just a dream, and you woke up. The third illusion that disappears is the illusion of control. The ego desperately wants to believe that it's in command, that it can control outcomes, people, circumstances, even its own thoughts and emotions. Observe how the ego reacts when something doesn't go as planned. Frustration, anger, despair, all these reactions are based on the belief that you should be in control and failed. But what if that belief was the very root of suffering? Tolle teaches that this illusion of control is a source of immense suffering, because reality constantly demonstrates that you're not in control. And every time that happens, the ego suffers. When this illusion disappears, something paradoxical happens. You stop trying to control and discover a much more effective way to navigate life. Instead of fighting against the river, you learn to flow with it. Instead of resisting what is, you accept and respond with intelligence. It's not passivity, it's wisdom. It's recognizing that you can choose your actions, but you can't control all the results. It's finding peace in uncertainty instead of anxiety. Tolle offers a liberating perspective here. He says that living beyond the ego is living in the recognition that there isn't a separate self to protect, defend, or promote. When the illusion of control dissolves, you experience life without the filter of personal identity, free from the need to control, judge, or manipulate. This may seem scary to the ego, but for the consciousness that you really are, it's absolute freedom. It's discovering that you can trust life, that the universe isn't your enemy, that there's a greater intelligence operating through everything, including you. The fourth illusion that disappears is the illusion that the future will bring salvation. The ego lives in constant postponement. I'll be happy when, I'll be at peace when, my life will really begin when. How many times have you thought, when I get that job, when I find the right partner, when I have more money, then I'll finally be happy? And how many times have you gotten what you wanted, only to discover that happiness still seemed to be somewhere else, in some even more distant future? Eckhart Tolle identifies this as one of the ego's most subtle traps. The belief that something in the future is going to complete you, a relationship, a major achievement, a certain amount of money, a state of enlightenment. Time when that illusion vanishes, you realize that the future never arrives. When the future arrives, it becomes the present, and if you can't be at peace in the present, you'll never be at peace, because the present is all there is. This doesn't mean abandoning goals or stopping yourself from creating. It means stopping holding your peace and happiness hostage to an imaginary future. It means living fully now, while also walking towards what you desire to create. Tolle makes an important distinction between manifesting from the ego and manifesting from consciousness. When we manifest from the ego, we tend to have a sense of lack and scarcity. We ask, how can I get what I want? In conscious manifestation, we create from presence and a feeling of sufficiency. We ask, what does the universe want from me? This shift in perspective completely transforms your relationship with the future. You still make plans, you still set intentions, but you're no longer desperate for results. You're no longer putting your peace at some distant point in time. The fifth illusion that vanishes is the illusion that you are your personal story. The ego creates an elaborate narrative about who you are, based on the past, on traumas, on achievements, on failures, on the roles you've played. You introduce yourself through this story. I'm someone who's been through this. I'm someone who achieved that. I'm someone who was a victim of... Each of these statements seems to define who you are. But are you really a collection of past events? Tolle calls this the mind-made self, an identity constructed entirely of thoughts about the past. And this identity seems so real that you defend it fiercely. Any challenge to your story feels like an attack on your very existence. When this illusion vanishes, you discover that you are not your story. You are the consciousness in which that story appears. You can have memories without being defined by them. You can recognize the past without being a prisoner to it. This is liberating in ways that words can barely capture. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack for decades and suddenly realizing you can simply take it off. Your story doesn't disappear, but it stops controlling you. Tolle explains that one way the ego dissolves is through intense suffering, through the turbulence. There is a dissolution of psychological attachments, such as hopes, ambitions, beliefs, status, wealth, and social roles. These attachments are the building blocks of a person's identity. But you don't need to wait for a crisis to break free from your story. Awareness is enough. When you observe your story as a story, when you see that it's a narrative created by the mind, it loses its hypnotic power. You might even enjoy the story without being a prisoner to it. The sixth illusion that vanishes is the illusion that thoughts are truth. Before spiritual awakening, you automatically believe almost everything your mind says. If your mind says you're not good enough, you believe it. If it says something terrible is going to happen, you believe it. If it says someone is against you, you believe it. Tolle explains that thoughts are just thoughts. They aren't automatically true. They're patterns of mental energy, often repetitive, often based on old conditioning. When this illusion vanishes, you develop the ability to question thoughts, to observe them without automatically believing them, to ask, is this really true? And even if it's true, is it helpful? This ability completely transforms your experience of life. You stop being a victim of your own mind. You stop being dragged around by every negative or frightening thought. You find a center of stability that thoughts can't disturb. Tolle emphasizes that unless you learn to recognize the false, as not being you, there can be no lasting transformation. You'll always end up being drawn back into illusion and into some form of pain. Seeing thoughts as thoughts, not as absolute truths, is one of the keys to permanent freedom. And that doesn't mean ignoring the mind or rejecting thought. It means using thought when necessary and letting go when it's not. It means having a healthy relationship with your own mind, instead of being enslaved by it. The seventh illusion that vanishes is the illusion that you need something to be complete. The ego lives in a permanent state of need. Something is always missing. You always need more. More money, more recognition, more love, more experiences. This feeling of lack is the driving force behind almost every unconscious human action. We buy things to fill the void. We seek relationships to feel complete. We pursue achievements to prove our worth. And all of this is based on the false premise that something is missing. Tolle identifies this feeling of inadequacy as the engine of the ego. It's what keeps it always searching, always dissatisfied, always chasing after something that promises fulfillment. When this illusion vanishes, you discover something shocking. You are already complete, not in theory, in direct experience. There is a fullness at the center of your being that doesn't depend on external circumstances. This doesn't mean you stop wanting things or seeking improvements. It means that your search no longer comes from a place of despair and lack. It comes from a place of abundance that wants to express itself and create. Tolle describes this as one of the most liberating discoveries of spiritual awakening. You realize that you've always been seeking yourself in things, seeking your completeness in relationships, achievements, experiences. And all this time, what you were seeking was already present. It was never absent. You just weren't looking in the right direction. When this external search ceases, an extraordinary peace settles in, not the peace that comes from getting what you want, but the peace that comes from realizing that you never needed anything to be complete. This peace cannot be disturbed by external circumstances, because it doesn't depend on them. The eighth illusion that vanishes is the illusion that you are the body. You've spent your whole life believing that you're a body that somehow developed consciousness, a physical object that thinks. This is perhaps the most deeply ingrained illusion in our materialistic culture. Modern science often reinforces this view by treating consciousness as a byproduct of the brain. But what if it's actually the other way around? Eckhart Tolle completely flips this perspective. You are not a body that has consciousness. You are consciousness that is having the experience of a body. The body appears in consciousness, not the other way around. When this illusion vanishes, something profound happens to the fear of death, because you realize that what you really are never was born and can never die. The body is born and dies, but the consciousness that you are exists before and beyond this temporary form. This isn't belief or faith. It's direct perception. It's seeing through the illusion that you are just matter, to recognize the infinite consciousness that you always have been. Eckhart Tolle recounts his own experience of awakening. He describes how the intense pressure of suffering forced his consciousness to withdraw from its identification with the unhappy and deeply fearful self, this false self, which is ultimately a fiction of the mind, collapsed immediately. What remained was his true nature, as the ever-present I am, consciousness in its pure state, before identification with any form. This experience isn't unique to Eckhart Tolle. It's what happens in every genuine awakening. The identification with the body-mind dissolves, and what remains is pure consciousness, not an empty or abstract consciousness, but a living, alert, infinitely creative presence. And when you realize that you are this consciousness, the relationship with the body changes completely. You still take care of it. You still feed it, exercise it, rest it, but you're no longer imprisoned by it. You are the space in which it appears. Now, it's important to understand something about these illusions. They don't vanish because you decide they should vanish. You cannot force the end of an illusion. The very effort of trying to end it keeps it alive. Illusions vanish through consciousness, through clear and non-judgmental observation. When you really see an illusion as an illusion, it loses its power, not because you fought against it, but because the light of consciousness dissolved it. Eckhart Tolle uses the metaphor of darkness and light. You cannot fight against the darkness. You cannot push it out of a room. All you can do is turn on the light, and when the light comes on, the darkness simply ceases to exist. The same is true for the illusions of the ego. You don't need to fight them. You need to bring consciousness to them, and in the light of that consciousness, they reveal themselves as what they always were. Mental constructs with no real substance. Eckhart Tolle is clear that every challenge, every obstacle that life seems to place in your path, is an opportunity for awakening, to become present, or to deepen the state of presence. Life is constantly inviting you to see through the illusions. The question is, do you accept the invitation? The process doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need crises or traumas. Simple awareness, mindfulness of the present moment, is enough. Every time you stop and notice, every time you observe a thought instead of being swept away by it, you are dissolving illusions. You might be wondering, what if I see through these illusions and don't like what I find? What if reality without illusions is worse than reality with them? Eckhart Tolle is clear about this. What remains when the illusions end is infinitely better than anything the illusions promised. You continue living, but without taking everything so seriously. There's less fear, less stress, less conflict, less suffering. You still use your mind, but in a much more focused and effective way. Free from the compulsive internal dialogue there is an inner stillness, free from identification with thoughts. There is peace. Some people fear that seeing through these illusions means losing motivation. If I don't need anything to be complete, why would I do anything if the future brings no salvation? Why would I plan? But Eckhart Tolle explains that the exact opposite happens. When you're no longer acting from fear and lack, you act from fullness and creativity. Your actions become more effective, not less, more joyful, not less. The difference is that you're no longer desperate. You're no longer chasing something to fill a void. You're creating from a place of inner abundance that wants to express itself in the world. Eckhart Tolle observes that feelings of stagnation and regression are some of the ego's most powerful tools to keep you identified with the concept of I. Commitment to awakening and perseverance on the path are among the keys to liberation. Don't give up just because it seems difficult. Difficulty is often a sign that something real is happening. It's important to understand that awakening isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process of deepening. You may have an initial glimpse and then spend years integrating that perception into all aspects of your life. Patience and kindness with yourself are essential. Another common concern is about relationships. If I realize that I'm not separate from others, can I still have intimate relationships? If I see through the illusion that I need something to be complete, can I still love? Eckhart Tolle teaches that relationships become much deeper when free from these illusions. Because you're no longer using the other person to fill your void. You're no longer projecting your unmet needs. You're no longer oscillating between idealization and disappointment. Instead, you can see the other person as they really are. You can love without conditions, without a hidden agenda, without the expectation that they complete you. This is true love, not the love of the ego, which is always a form of need in disguise. Eckhart Tolle explains that in the awakened relationship. Thus, one dimension is your human side, your personality, your stories, your emotional conditioning. But as you awaken, you realize that there is a deeper dimension of who you are, the deep self, the timeless being that you are. And when two people meet in that dimension, the relationship gains a depth impossible to describe. There's also the question of spiritual ego. Eckhart Tolle warns about the danger of using awakening to feel superior. This contradicts the essence of awakening, which is universal and humble. Awakening isn't about standing out. It's about returning to wholeness. When you see through the illusions, you don't become special. You recognize that everyone has always been what you just discovered in yourself. If you felt the truth of these words, the super thanks below is your way of supporting this work. It's you saying that seeing through the illusions matters, that consciousness is more valuable than any comfortable belief, that the truth liberates, even when it challenges everything you thought you knew. Every contribution helps us continue bringing you these teachings that dissolve illusions and reveal what we are beyond them. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Which of these 8 illusions still holds the most power over you? Which one do you still confuse with reality? Tell us in the comments below. That recognition could be the beginning of your liberation. Remember what Eckhart Tolle teaches. The first step toward liberation is awareness. When you observe a pattern, when you see an illusion as an illusion, you're no longer completely identified with it. A space opens up, and in that space, choice becomes possible. Transformation becomes possible. The path to awakening isn't about becoming someone else. It's about realizing that you already are everything. It's about recognizing the illusion of the separate self and awakening to the truth that you are the limitless and infinite consciousness. That is the essence of all life. These 8 illusions are doorways, and each time you see through one of them, you get closer to the freedom that's always been there. The freedom that you are, not something to conquer, but something to recognize, and not something distant, but something that's always been closer than your breath. Eckhart Tolle's invitation is simple. Observe, perceive. Bring awareness to what's happening now. Don't try to change or fix anything. Just see. And in the light of that clear seeing, the illusions begin to dissolve on their own. You don't need years of practice. You don't need elaborate techniques. You just need a moment of genuine perception, a moment of total presence. And in that moment, you can glimpse what has always been, beyond all the illusions that the mind has created. And if this video showed you something that you didn't see before, share it with someone who's still trapped in illusions without knowing it. Someone who's suffering by believing in lies they've never questioned. Your sharing could be the light that begins to dissolve the darkness. The truth that Tolle teaches is simple. You were never these illusions. They appeared in you, and when you see them clearly, they lose the power to control you. What remains is what you've always been: pure consciousness, infinite presence, absolute freedom.